Chapter 4. Who is one to mastership? What I say, I speak true when I say that Buck's two devils. That was Francois's speech next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and by light pointed them out. That Spitz fights like hell, said Perrault as he surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. And that Buck fights like two hells, was Francois's answer. Now we make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble. Sure. When Perrault packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up the place Spitz would occupy as leader, but Francois, not noticing him, brought Solix to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solix was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solix in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Eh? Eh? Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. Look at that Buck. Him kill that Spitz. Him think he take the job. Go away, Shook, he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Solix. The old dog didn't like it, and showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francis was obdurate, but when he turned his back again and displaced Solix, who was not at all unwilling to go, Francois was angry. Now, by gar, I fix you, he said, coming back with a heavy club in his hand. Buck had remembered the man in the red sweater and retreated slowly, nor did he attempt to charge when Solix was once more brought forward, but he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with bitterness and rage while he circled the watch of the club as to dodge it if thrown by Francois, because he was becoming weight in the wise of the club. The driver went about work and called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his place in front of Dave. Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francois followed him, whereupon again he retreated. After some time of this, Francois threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was now in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have leadership. It was his by right. He'd earned it, and he wouldn't be content with less. Perrault took a hand. Between them they ran about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They cursed him, and his fathers and his mothers before him, and all his seed to come after him in the remotest generation, and every hair on his body and drop on his veins, and he answered a curse with a snarl and kept out of their reach. He didn't try to run away, but retreated round and round the camp, advertising plainly when his desire was met, he'd come and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore. Time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at the courier, who shrugged his shoulders in a sign they were beaten. Then Francois went up to where Solix stood and called to Buck. Buck laughed as dogs laugh, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Solix's traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled in an unbroken line, ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck except the front. Once more Francois called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. Throw down the club, Perrault commanded. Francois complied, whereupon Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung round in position as the head of the team. His traces were fastened, the sled broke out, and with both men running, they dashed on to River Trail. Highly as the dog driver had forevalued Buck, with his 2 devils he found, when the day was yet young they had undervalued him. As at a bound Buck took up duties of leadership, and where judgment was required, quick thinking and quick acting, he showed himself superior of Spitz, whom Francois had never seen an equal. But it was giving law and making his mates live up to it that Buck excelled. Dave and Solix didn't mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. Their business was just to toil and toil mightily in the traces. So long as that wasn't interfered with, they didn't care what happened. Billy, the good-natured, could lead for all he cared, so long as they kept order. The rest of the team, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz. Their surprise was great now that Buck proceeded to lick them into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels and was never pulled more of an ounce of his weight against the breastband that he was compelled to do, was swiftly and mildly shaken for even loafing, and the day he was done he was more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe the sour one was punished roundly, a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Buck simply smothered him by superior weight and cut him up till he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solidarity, and once more the dogs leaped as one in the traces. At Rink Rapids, 2 native huskies, Teek and Kuna, were added, and the celerity which Buck broke them in took Francois's breath. Never such a dog as that Buck, he cried. No, never. Him's worth $1,000, by gar. What do you say, Perot? Perot nodded. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. Trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard, and there was no new-fallen snow with which to contend. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump with infrequent stoppages. 30-Mile River was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered in one day, going out what had taken them 10 days coming in. In one run, they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake LaBarge to White Horse Rapids. Across Marsh, Tagish, and Bennett, 70 miles of lakes, they flew so fast that the men, whose turn it was to row behind, towed behind the sled at the end of a rope. And on the last night of the second week that they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope with a light Skagway and the shipping at their feet. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days they averaged 40 miles. For 3 days Pearl and Francois threw chess up and down the streets of Skagway and were deluged with invitations to drink, while the team was the constant center of a worshipful crowd of dog-busters and mushers. 3 or 4 Western bad men aspired to clean out the town, were riddled like pepper boxes for their pains. Public interest turned out to the idols. But next came the official orders, and Francois called Buck to him, threw his arms around him, and wept over him. That was the last of Francois and Perot. Like other men, they had passed out of Buck's life for good. A Scott half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light run now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind. This was a mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck didn't like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it, in the manner of Dave and Salix, after seeing that his mates, whether they prided or not, did the fair share. It was monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity, one day very like another. At a certain time each morning the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then while they broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and were under way in an hour after the darkness fell gave warning of dawn. At night camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. The dogs were fed. To them this is the one feature of a day, although it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten, for an hour or so with the other dogs, now that there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them. 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lay near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised, eyes blinking drearily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and the cement swimming tank, and Isabel the Mexican hairless, and Toots the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He wasn't homesick. Sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more important were the memories of his heredity that gave things that he'd never seen a seeming familiarity. Instincts which were memories of his ancestors became habits, and had lapsed in later days, and still, in him, quickened and became alive again. Sometimes as he crouched there, dreaming at the flames, it seemed that flames were of another fire, and that he crouched by this fire with a different man from a half-breed cook before him. The other man with short legs and arms, muscles stringy and knotty rather than round and swollen. The hair of this man was long and matted, head slant back away from his eyes. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching his hand, which hung midway between knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places across the chest and shoulders, and down the inside of the arms and thighs, was matted into almost a thick fur. He didn't stand erect, but with the trunk inclined from the hips on legs that bent at knees. About his body there was a peculiar springiness or resilience, almost cat-like, with a quick alertness as to one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and not seen. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire with his head between his legs and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, and his hand clasped above his head as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. Beyond that fire in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2. He knew they were the eyes of great beasts of prey. He could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night, and dreaming by the Yukon bank with lazy eyes blinking at the fire. Sounds and sights of another world would make the hair rise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressingly, or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted, "Hey, Buck, wake up!" Where the other world would vanish and the real world came back to his eyes, he'd yawn and stretch as though he'd been asleep. It was a hard trip with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. They were short of weight and in poor condition when they made Dawson. Would have taken 10 days or a week's rest at least, but in 2 days' time they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks loaded with letters for the outside. Dogs were tired, the drivers were grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair through it all and did their best for their animals. Each night the dogs were tended first. They ate before drivers ate, and no man sought a sleeping robe till he'd seen to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still their strength went down. Since the beginning of winter they'd traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles tell the life upon the toughest. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night, and Joe was sourer than ever. Solis was unapproachable, blind side or other. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched and he made his nest, the driver failed him. Out of the harness and down, he didn't get on his feet again till harness up time in the morning. Sometimes in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stop of the sled, or straining to start it, he'd cry out in pain. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked over it at mealtime and over the last pipes before going to bed. One night they held a consultation. He was brought from the nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong on the inside, but they could find no broken bones or make it out. By the time Sizar Bry was reached, he was so weak he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scottish half-breed called a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Solis, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave and let him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunted and growled while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when he saw Solis in the position he held and served for so long. For the pride of trace and toil was his, and sickened to death he couldn't bear another dog do his work. When the sled started, he floundered in the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, and attacked Solis with his teeth, rushing him and trying to thrust him into the snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and go between him and the sled, all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The half-breed tried to drive him away with the whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man didn't have the heart to strike him harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled, where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in soft snow, where the going was more difficult, till exhausted. Then he fell and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously as the long train of sleds churned by. With the last remnant of his strength, he managed to stagger on behind till the train made another stop, and he floundered past the sleds to his own, where he stood beside Solis. The driver lingered a moment to get his pipe for the man behind. Then he returned and started the dogs. They swung out on the trail with remarkable lack of exertion, turned their heads uneasily, and stopped in the surprise. The driver was surprised, too. The sled didn't move. He called his comrades to witness the sight. Dave bit through Solis' traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with his eyes to stay there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked of how a dog could break its heart, though being denied the work that had killed it, and recalled instances they'd known where dogs, too old for the toil or injured, died because they were cut out of the traces. And they held it a mercy, since Dave was going to die anyways, that he should die in the traces, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again and proudly pulled as old, though more than once he cried out involuntarily and bit the bite of the inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged to the traces. Once the sled ran up upon him, he limped thereafter in his hind legs. But he held out till camp was reached, and when the driver made a place for him by the fire, morning found him too weak to travel. Harnessed up, he tried to crawl to the driver. By convulsive efforts, he got on his feet, staggered, and fell. Then he wormed his way forward slowly where the harness was put on his mates. He'd advance his forelegs, then drag his body in a sort of hitching movement. And he'd advance his forelegs and hitch again, a few more inches. The strength had left him, and his mates saw of him. The last his mates saw of him was gasping in the snow, yearning toward them. Then they could hear the mournful howling when they passed out of sight in a belt of river timber. There the train halted. The Scottish half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had made. The men ceased talking, and a revolver shot rang out. The men came back hurriedly. The whip snapped, the bells tinkled merrily, and the sleds turned along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of river trees.